Who has a new book. It's called Calm Your Mind with Food, a revolutionary guide to controlling your anxiety. And I want to, first of all, welcome you, Uma. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and I've been going through the book and enjoying it very much. So right off the bat, I'd love to ask you, um, what made you write this follow-up book? Because, you talk about nutritional psychiatry and you have a previous book dealing with the mind and food and diet. What's new about this one?
Thanks for that question. My first book is an overarching description of mental health conditions and how to eat foods that help those conditions or to step back from foods that harm those conditions. The book came out at the beginning of COVID, and what happened during my practice in COVID was that there were significant highlights. In the spring of 2020, a medication called Zoloft or sertraline, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, went on shortage in the entire United States. Physicians were all informed to be concerned about their patients who were receiving these prescriptions. And the reason was that there was an uptick of new diagnoses of anxiety. So these were not individuals who were getting refills, these are new prescriptions. This is the first time it's happened in my career, any SSRI that went on shortage. And that really was an indicator of how poorly people were coping. We know that COVID was tough. And the Lancet published subsequent data to say that anxiety, which has always been the most common mental health condition worldwide, and in the US, it's 3 times the level of depression. But overall, anxiety increased by 25%. And that was what I was seeing in my practice. Every single person, age group, demographic was suffering in some form. It could have been poor sleep, but when you actually uncovered what was going on, someone was super anxious. They weren't able to sleep because they were watching all the television segments, giving the data about COVID. They were afraid and there was angst. So it felt important, Deepak, to offer people a solution for what most people are feeling these days to some extent. And anxiety is just now almost, has reached epidemic proportions in terms of mental health.
Good. So we now definitely have a connection between nutrition and mental health, and that's what your book is talking about. Do provide some scientific evidence on the research to support this concept of nutritional psychiatry. I think people are not familiar with this concept at all.
Sure. So one of the ways that we understand the connection between food and mental health is that there's been several evolving concepts around mental health. We now know that mental health is not an above the neck concept. It is a whole body concept. We also know that the evolution of the science behind the gut microbiome, which has really evolved in the last couple of decades and come forward with research, something that Hippocrates, related to eons ago, that the science had to follow. We understand that the gut-brain connection starts to unfold the food-mood connection. The gut and brain originate from the exact same cells in the human embryo. They divide apart to form 2 organs and then are connected by the vagus nerve, the 10th cranial nerve, which allows for bidirectional messaging, especially chemical messages like neurotransmitters between these 2 organs. When we then understand that 90 to 95% of serotonin and its receptors are in the gut, then we start to realize that the food that's getting digested as we eat food, chew, swallow, and digest, is interacting in the same environment with the same gut microbes, the trillions of microbes that reside in the gut microbiome, as where the receptors are being created, as where this messaging is occurring. And I usually step back for a second and say to my patients, well, what happens when you have a headache? You have the perception of pain somewhere in your head. You take a pill, you swallow it, drink some water, and you hope the headache goes away. You don't really think about the fact that the medication is treating the pain in your head. You're swallowing the pill. Well, in a similar way, and with obviously a lot more complexity, there is a similar pathway to food over time. So if we start to consume an unhealthy diet, like the standard American diet, called SAD for a reason, also called the Western diet, then it makes sense that so many people may be suffering with anxiety, because we also know that processed food sales were increased at the beginning of COVID and have remained high. In fact, the beginning of COVID, some manufacturers went back and started producing more things like canned soups, cookies, and things that were highly processed because there was increased demand. So I see nutrition as having been one of the big impactors for how our anxiety has panned out over this time. But it's also one of the most remediable factors, because we can make choices that are different to help calm our minds.
Do you feel then, from what you just said, that refined, manufactured, processed, factory-produced food with all the chemicals in it is the culprit here for dysbiosis, inflammation, and subsequent anxiety?
It's definitely one of the reasons that close to 90% of most Americans have some level of metabolic problem. They may not have full metabolic syndrome, but they have some metabolic, they are somehow metabolically unhealthy, let's say, as a blanket term. It is definitely a component. I think stress levels are high. There are many different things, but how we eat is definitely one of those reasons. And the more processed, the more ultra processed foods, the colorants, the dyes, the food stabilizers have really disrupted our gut. In fact, there was an animal study published in around March of 2022, which showed that when they fed a food thickener called carboxymethylcellulose to rats, that it affected their microbiome, and their microbiome had lacked the ability, or had a lessened ability, to produce short chain fatty acids when they were fed this thickener. Now, this carboxymethylcellulose is used to thicken many different foods that we eat. The fact that it caused these animals to not be able to produce what we want our microbiome to be producing, which is short chain fatty acids, to me was at least a clue, and more research has to follow, that the food we eat and the number of preservatives contained in them are definitely impacting things like dysbiosis and the overgrowth of the negative or bad microbes in the gut that love those ultra processed foods or the added and refined sugars, etc.
So, of course, you're a psychiatrist, and we know so many causes for anxiety. It's a pandemic. I always think of anxiety and fear as the anticipation of trauma in some way or another, the memory of trauma being anger, the anticipation of trauma being fear and anxiety, blaming yourself becomes guilt, shame, and all of that, totality of events leads to depression as well, which is the number one pandemic along with anxiety. So let's say a patient comes to you with anxiety. How would you first evaluate them, and then what specific dietary changes would you recommend in dealing with anxiety? Are there certain foods that you suggest for everyone, or is it more specific, and does it involve even analyzing the microbiome?
Mm-hmm. So, first, I think what's helpful is for someone to understand if they have anxiety. So they could be the textbook DSM-5-TR definition, but they could also be the human experience, because as I've said before, I don't think that the DSM-5-TR, which is what mental health clinicians use, frankly captures all human condition. People do not fall into a check box of lists, but they do feel a certain way. So anxiety is a mental health condition defined by an excess of stress or worry that inhibits our daily activities. So when someone is not able to function and feels so overwrought by that anxiety, it's time to pay attention. It can also manifest as physical symptoms, things like increased heart rate, shortness of breath, sweating, lightheadedness, involuntary fidgeting, just feeling uncomfortable, but also poor sleep. So someone might come in and say to me, my stomach is upset, but that actually could be an anxious gut. So I have to explore that further. Within the hospital, we are very, our testing is rudimentary. So we don't have the types of microbiome testing that a private company can offer that will analyze the microbiome, give a read of what is in that microbiome. Unfortunately, the hospitals don't have that technology yet, and it's not covered by insurance. So sometimes it's limited to a really good clinical exam and some blood tests that I work in conjunction with a primary care doctor to understand if there's a nutrient deficiency. One of the things I covered in this book, Calm Your Mind with Food, is the micronutrients, the macronutrients, the bioactives. So people sort of understand the terms and they know what's important. To answer your question about what the specifics are versus general, I think there's some general lists of foods that are super helpful to start to move towards that will help calm your mind. And then there are specific things which I pulled out through the research for the book. One of the things is that iron deficiency anemia is listed by the World Health Organization as the most common nutritional deficiency. 30% of people worldwide have iron deficiency anemia, mostly in women of childbearing age, but also in children. And what is anxiety? What is low iron, associated with? Also associated with anxiety. So one of the things I want people to be aware of is these things that can be corrected. We can correct it both through our eating. You may need to get blood tests with your doctor, who might then need to give you a supplement to bring up your iron levels. But specifically in the age group of children who are also suffering immensely during this time, and we know that the suicide rate, for example, in teens and adolescents has increased, bringing the mental health crisis to an even worse level. If we eat differently, we pay attention to these nutrients, it is critical. Another more specific nutrient is magnesium, because there's several Americans who are deficient in magnesium. It could be the lack of nutrient-dense food that we're eating because of our preponderance for ultra-processed foods. That's a simple thing. Your doctor can assess that, check the appropriate blood test, and you can eat foods that contain magnesium. You can also, for a short while, supplement to bring your level up. The third one is vitamin D. Low vitamin D is associated with anxiety as well as depression. Simple things: spend 10 minutes outdoors in daylight without sunblock or sunscreen allows you to really obtain 80% formation of vitamin D for that day. So it's just a great habit to do that. After that, of course, use your sunblock or your sunscreen. So there are those types of specifics that are very much associated with anxiety. And then I go through, lists of different foods, a protocol, and then recipes to match the protocol, as well as an anti-anxiety shopping list. So someone has this on their fingertips to start to implement.
Do you want to share any anecdotes or personal stories about somebody who's had dramatic effects through these interventions?
Well, I'll share a couple of things. One is that I wanted people to understand that anxiety sometimes also comes from good events in your life and happy things. And I think that's important for people to understand. That's when I share a little bit of my personal story in the book. The sort of success of my first book, which I feel very fortunate about, also meant that I was at times a hamster in a wheel, just, answering press inquiries and being involved with media and helping the book to gain momentum. And it was this good thing. The book was doing very well and it was resonating with people, but I also found myself very anxious because I was in this good phase, but it felt like there wasn't a way to step back and stop that. Just one example, but I think one of the most powerful examples from my practice was showing the impact that a dietary change can make in a woman who was young, lived in the Boston area, and was really an executive in her company, but a junior executive, but she got promoted. And she came to me literally begging me to prescribe an SSRI such as Prozac or even Celexa. She was referred by her primary care doctor, but upon taking a proper history, I realized that 6 weeks prior to appearing in my office, she had a promotion at work. And immediately that she was promoted, her entire lifestyle changed. Lifestyle being a huge factor in conditions like anxiety, because what changed for her was from taking lunch to work every day and eating most meals at home, except going out with her friends maybe on the weekend. Her entire life had changed to being 6 out of 7 days traveling, eating in airports, arriving late at cities, eating bar snacks or something out of the bar fridge in the room, not being nourished well, starting to eat more fast foods, networking more due to all the promotion that she got. With networking came 2 glasses of wine a night or cocktail that she was not really used to. She maybe had a glass of wine, like I said, on the weekend. So all of this had disrupted her gut microbiome. And even though she hadn't gained weight, she actually was exercising and doing yoga and stuff like that. Her microbiome had definitely changed. And by pointing that out to her, she was actually excited to hear that, because it felt like these are changes she could make. So we instituted a different way that she could manage traveling, snacks on the go. What could she do when she arrived in a city? What could she eat? How could she switch out, a glass of refreshing sparkling water with another glass of wine? What could she do to make this work for her life? And over the course of about 3 to 4 weeks, within the first week, she was sleeping better when we started to make changes. But within a month, she was feeling a lot better. And we actually, because she was under close care and she wasn't acutely ill where she was suicidal or more severely ill, we were able to manage the situation with food. And, she still writes to me and tells me that she's doing well, and she's done even better at work, but now she has a plan as to how to manage the food along with lifestyle that has helped her. That's always something that I remember, and I love hearing back from patients I've treated years ago who continue to do well. And they all know it's not perfect. 80% of the time they're really working to eat healthier whole foods, and 20% of the time they might be running through an airport and not have the healthiest meal. But it's keeping that balance of the microbiome that has really helped them.
Just listening to you, alcohol is such a big part of the culture, and sometimes it's very difficult for people in this culture anyway to completely give up alcohol. What's your take on a glass of wine or 2 glasses of wine, or somebody has a little whiskey every night? What is that harmful, first of all? Because some people, 1 or 2 drinks makes them kind of relax as well. But then we know that alcohol increases inflammation, disturbs sleep. So if somebody asks you, what's your take on alcohol? I don't drink alcohol, but what
Many people do. I think that's a great question, because I think that it's related to creating a more personalized plan for the person who's in front of me. Given that more people than not drink alcohol, some of the time what I have to do is really work to see what my patient is doing. And is that glass of wine or that cocktail setting off the anxiety? When someone is relying on a glass of red wine, for example, or 2 to fall asleep, I know that I can guide them around that, because it's going to affect their sleep architecture, and they are going to be more disrupted in terms of their sleep. When someone has been, like the patient I just mentioned, consuming more alcohol that is not usual for them, and it has caused the inflammation and disrupted their microbiome, it's easy to explain to them that connection. But it's not the same for everyone. And with some individuals, they have a glass of wine and they feel more relaxed. And part of it is balancing what's moderation for them and defining it in terms of their use of alcohol. Obviously, there should be guidelines, and we should know things like if someone is consuming an excess amount and their families are noticing and their friends are noticing and their behavior is changing, maybe it's anxiety, maybe it's depression, maybe it's irritability, whatever it is, functioning at work, then there needs to be a larger intervention around treatment and help and support, because that could be moving now down the road of addiction or substance use disorder. In short, I have to be flexible with it because more of my patients consume alcohol than don't. Where I see it as a problem, I work with them to cut back, replace. There are lots of, there's a huge sober curious movement. So having a botanical that's alcohol free allows you to be at a bar or even serve a beverage at home where you are consuming no alcohol at all. So I think there are innovative ways that people can still feel integrated and part of the team, the crowd, the work event, or the home life with friends and family around them, and actually not be consuming alcohol at all. So I feel as though I can't fully say just give it up unless someone is struggling around anxiety, if that makes sense, because people are so different. Age and demographics also come into it. So
These days, I mean, we live in New York City. Every block, I see all these THC shops. People are consuming cannabis a lot. What's your take on cannabis? When you read about it, some people say it's anti-inflammatory. It helps people sleep. It doesn't have the addictive potential, say, of alcohol or cigarette smoking. Just can you comment where, because cannabis is becoming a big part of the culture too now?
I feel like it's uh, really emerged as part of the culture, and I think that recreational use is different from prescription use, but even with prescription use, um, there isn't a very high bar to receive a legal prescription. That being said, I also spent a lot of my career in the emergency room, and I've seen the impact on in mental health of cannabis on individuals presenting with psychosis, with a short psychotic break, with severe symptoms, because they actually don't know where that cannabis is coming from, and it's been mixed or cut with other illegal with illegal drugs. So the cannabis may be something they can use recreationally, but the effects can be quite severe. So I'm really cautious with it. I feel that, if one of my patients is using it recreationally, I want to offer them some guidance around it. I want to make sure that they're remaining functional, because we know that cannabis drives appetite. They can start gaining weight. It does lots of different things. So also within that, there's the different components of it as well. And there are the healthier components, there are gummies, there are different things that people are using. So I have to get a proper history on what they're using, what they're doing, and how is it impacting them. I just think that being cautious, whether it's alcohol, THC, psychedelics, or whatever it is, it just behooves me as a physician to be that way. And people may not like that, but I have to offer them guidance based on my clinical experience.
I'm speaking to Dr. Naidoo, whose new book is called Calm Your Mind with Food, a Revolutionary Guide to Controlling Your Anxiety. Dr. Naidoo is a nutritional psychiatrist, and she's board certified Harvard nutritional psychiatrist, professional chef, and a nutritional biologist. She's the founder and director of the first hospital based nutritional and metabolic psychiatry service in the United States at MGH, Massachusetts General Hospital. You can read all about her when you look at the books. This is a very important book, I feel. Yeah, she's divided the book into several parts. Part one talks about the problem, fighting the global anxiety epidemic, gut feelings, immune to anxiety, inflammation on the brain, anxiety and leptin, and the appetite hormone, the dangers of metabolic disruption. So we can't go over all these things. But I've been, as an endocrinologist, very interested in both leptin and ghrelin as regulating both our appetite and our satiety, and of course, playing a role. But what does this chapter specifically talk about? Anxiety and leptin.
So it really is helping people understand that leptin is a hormone that helps remind us or tell us that we are satiated. And sometimes when individuals, simple things like they notice their appetite has changed, they usually eat a plate of food at dinner and then they satiated and they go on to have maybe some berries as a snack. They now feel they need a second plate of food. One of the things that can happen over time is leptin can get dysregulated and you can develop leptin resistance, meaning that it no longer signals you that you're full, you're satiated after meal. And one of the things, if you take a step back and look at the history and ask some more questions that might have happened, is that they've developed this because they've changed something in their eating pattern and they are tending towards less healthy foods that are pro-inflammatory. So it's just, I put this in so that people understand there are just natural ways of how we eat that is impacting these metabolic functions in our body. You're the endocrinologist, so you're the expert on these. I should be asking you, but it really is a way to help people understand how food is impacting their mental health, and that it's not just the weight, it's not just the preponderance towards type 2 diabetes. All of these are connected. And as I said a little while back, it's no longer just an above the neck concept. It's this integration with the rest of the body, including the gut.
So leptin makes you satisfied. It increases satiety, and ghrelin is the one that makes you hungry, right?
Yes.
Ghrelin.
Yes.
Now, I believe that our sleep-wake cycles and circadian rhythms have a lot to do with it. So if somebody staying up late, eats very late, it can disrupt the satiety hunger balance.
It's so true. In fact, shift workers struggle with that a lot. So nurses and other shift workers actually do quite often come in with that issue.
Part 2 of the book deals with macronutrients, micronutrients, bioactives, herbal medicine, and also includes a chapter on anti-anxiety shopping trip. Very interesting. And then the part 3 of the book is 6 pillars to calm your mind, building your anti-anxiety eating plan, cooking tips for a calm kitchen, and ultimately a whole chapter on recipes to calm your mind. So in this book, there are lots of insights, a lot of practical advice, lots of good recipes, and lots of recommendations that you can easily incorporate in your daily life. So let me share with you a little bit about my kind of personal dietary habits.
I love that.
I eat one big meal a day, usually lunchtime, and if I sometimes if I have let's say in the midday I have a small meal, then I can make my evening meal the one big meal. So I actually end up with what would be the equivalent of intermittent fast, but not with any kind of compulsion. It just happens to be that my diet has maximum diversity of plant-based foods, 7 colors of the rainbow, 6 tastes of life, as we say in Ayurveda. It includes every day some kimchi, kombucha in the evenings, and a lot of prebiotics, fiber, including, I have a Chinese restaurant that I go to where you can buy lotus root and cauliflower and asparagus, and food is very high in prebiotics. I actually don't take any probiotics regularly. I don't feel the need to if I have a high fiber diet. And we don't at home at least buy food from anything that's manufactured, processed, refined, or has high sugar. what would you say about this kind of routine, or anything that you would add to my personal routine?
I love that actually. I would I think that's a great way to go. And I also like the fact that you are not compulsively fasting. You're just naturally probably not hungry in the morning and you probably have tea or coffee. I know you have coffee because of your brother. That's another reason I have a lot of coffee. But that you eating in a certain window that suits you. You're also flexible around. You may have a big meal at lunch most often, but sometimes the schedule may not permit and you may switch that out. I appreciate that you're adding in the fiber, the colors, the biodiversity to your gut. Really a plant-rich diet, which we know has proven many health benefits. But depending on what proteins you eat, I would say the one thing I would ask is if you consume dairy, do you feel, adding in some yogurt because that would just naturally give you more of the probiotics. I have a recipe for homemade granola. So a lot of people, certainly in the US, I mean, culturally, we eat yogurt in a savory way as well, with spices and as a writer. But I'm also, one of the things I like people to do is add a little bit of, Greek yogurt and make a homemade granola so you can control the level of sugar. Anything that you add to it even has extra dark natural chocolate, dehydrated coconut for that nice crunch. That could be a nice addition. Um, I'm guessing you drink a lot of water and tea is my guess. So that's, calming teas are a good idea.
I drink a lot of water, not much tea. I have yogurt without sugar. Now, a lot of people eat yogurt. Yogurt usually is these days, a lot of people have flavored yogurt.
Flavored yogurts, but it has a ton of added sugar. Yeah.
What do you think of the flavored yogurts?
So the fruited or flavored yogurts are a problem that people don't realize. And it's a bit of a misstep and a marketing ploy because the yogurt on its own is healthy if you consume dairy. And actually now there are soy and coconut yogurts if you don't consume dairy. And they often have the positive benefits by the addition. The fruited yogurts, a small half cup can have up to 6 to 8 teaspoons of added sugar, even if it has blueberries in it. And you know that because 4 grams of sugar is 1 teaspoon. So if you just make that conversion, when you look at a small yogurt, you'll know that there's a lot of added sugar. So go for the plain one. I like the Greek yogurt. Well, it doesn't have to be, but the high protein, because that gives you another source of protein. And add in berries and cinnamon is a great sweetener. And cinnamon also has been shown to help with stabilizing blood sugar on a different level. So I think that's a great way to sweeten. It's a great way to add some berries to your day. So I think that fruited yogurts, we have to be a little bit careful about those. And I'd much rather you add your own additions to yogurt. And so to round up your question, the only other thing I would ask is because I'm a vegetarian and I've always had to watch my protein sources. I was just raised vegetarian. It's not a dietary preference or anything like that. It's just what I'm used to. And so I've become careful about making sure I have enough protein. But I think we can't get mistaken here. We also need the fiber that you're speaking about. Most Americans don't eat enough fiber, and research has shown that we worry about protein maybe too much. But I've just had to pay attention because that also helps me feel satiated. And things like yogurt, cottage cheese, um, and tofu, tempeh, things like that are super helpful to add to the
Beans,
diet.
beans, lentils.
Beans, lentils.
I see. And raita, of course, you mentioned, yogurt with
Yeah,
the
yogurt.
raita with some,
Some
what is it?
savories like spices or
Yeah,
things like that. Okay.
wonderful. This is a new field. I remember when I started speaking about food and mood a long time ago in 1988. There was a study I had read in 1980 about, rabbits that were fed a diet that was very high in cholesterol, but if you poked them and petted them, they had a different metabolic pathway. It was criticized. Now that study is been verified by other people. So it's also not just what you eat, but your state of mind when you're eating it. If you're stressed, you'll obviously have lots of cortisol and adrenaline shifting to a different pathway. So mindful eating practices are very important as well, right?
Mindful eating practices, and that third part of the book, I talk about, speaking to your point, Deepak, the Power Line from the Blue Zones, and where they talk about your tribe, your sense of community, eating in community, mindful practices, preparing food together. All of these things are hugely important. I think about my days as a resident, when I would run around and eat on the go and never be able to sit down for a meal. And I really had to relearn better eating habits after residency, because your entire body and system is stressed, and that's not a good way to live. So absolutely true. How you eat, the context is
In
important.
the 80s, if you said anything, I remember, about nutrition, patients would come to me as my practice and say, I changed my diet and, autoimmune disease went away, my angina went away, occasionally even a remission in cancer. Actually, I didn't believe my patients. I didn't know what to, how to, there was no science then on food. The science started emerging. Um, would you say right now, as a active physician practicing at Massachusetts General Hospital, do you still get skepticism from, say, professional colleagues, or that's history now? I remember in my days as a resident, if you said I changed my diet and my disease got better, the physicians would just, their eyes would roll up.
Right, as doctors, most doctors don't study nutrition, so to some extent, I do see their perspective. I've had an interesting um, time, because I've had support from where I work, from within my department, and that has really helped for me to grow and develop what I'm doing. I think there are skeptics out there. Not all psychiatrists are practicing this way, not even at my own hospital. And I think that, once in a while you'll have something, say someone make a remark or reach out and have a comment. And, I always lead with humility around this, because the science is ever evolving. And we know what we know, but I also feel like we're not harming anyone if we're offering them healthy eating ideas based on the scientific evidence related to mental health. So I don't see a problem with that unless someone has an allergy or an intolerance. So to the naysayers and the people who feel, oh, you are this or that, whatever, I've not, fortunately, not really had personal issues with it from people, but I also know this is not the mainstream. So I'm always very careful about this not being prescriptive. This is where the science is. This is where the data is. My editors, have always agreed to add my end notes, which are very long, so someone can look up the study in live time and see that the fact I'm commenting on or referring to in a chapter is based on X number of studies. And I think that's important in a newer, more nascent field to allow for that. But I hope by the next time you and I talk on a podcast, Deepak, that we would have moved the needle forward on the food as medicine movement.
My very special guest has been Dr. Naidoo. She's a nutritional psychiatrist. She's also the author of a previous bestseller, This Is Your Brain on Food. And this is the book, Calm Your Mind with Food, a revolutionary guide to controlling your anxiety. Pick it up, and I'm sure you'll benefit. Thank you, Uma, for joining me.
Thank you so much, Deepak, for having me and for your support.
Thank you.